Students often find it odd that that American colonists went to war to safeguard local self-government, created a constitution in the Articles of Confederation that enshrined the sovereignty and independence of these 13 separate states. But then very quickly after that, only 4 or 5 years after the end of the war, reversed course, 4 years after the end of the war, reversed course by adopting a new constitution, the federal constitution, that created a strong central government and curtailed the sovereignty and independence of these 13 states. One possible explanation for the rapid replacement of the Articles of Confederation with the Second American Constitution is that the Articles of Confederation did not reflect the revolutionists' true political values and the revolution's true political ends. That instead, the Articles were just a wartime stopgap. And as soon as the war was over, Americans went about finishing the job. So in this view, the 1787 Constitution is the true endpoint of the revolution, okay, because it reflected the desired outcome of the 1776 rebellion. And according to this view, the revolutionists envisioned a sovereign American state instead of 13 separate sovereign independent states, and they wanted a common national government with exclusive powers. The contrary explanation for this quick transition from the first constitution to the second constitution is that in the period between 1776 and 1781, I mean, between the start of the war and the end of combat operations, major combat operations, that during that period, during the period that we identify as the Revolutionary War, Americans did not expect the United States government to govern them. Okay. However, between the end of the war and 1787, increasing numbers of Americans did. Okay, so Americans really changed their minds about 13 independent sovereign states. Now, ratification in 1787 and 1788, ratification was still a very close call, but the argument here, according to the second explanation, is that there were enough Americans who had elevated their expectations of what the American government, the central government, should do for them. Okay, so in this formulation, the 1787 Constitution was not the endpoint of the 1776 Revolution. It was not part of the American Revolution because it did not reflect the desired outcome of the 1776 rebellion. Okay. The revolutionists did not want a common national government to govern them. They had envisioned 13 sovereign and independent states and not a consolidated country. And that's why they articulated this vision in their first constitution and achieved that goal in 1781 or 1783 when the War of Independence ended. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 demonstrates the change in mentality among Americans that is suggested by this second explanation that I just gave you. Shays' Rebellion did not convince the citizens of Massachusetts that they needed a stronger central government to protect them from domestic unrest, domestic rebellion. After all, we know that Massachusetts suppressed Shays' Rebellion decisively on its own, without any help from other states or from the United States of America. The reason Shays' Rebellion strengthened the Federalists in Massachusetts, Federalists, the supporters of the new Constitution. So the reason Shays' Rebellion strengthened the Federalists in Massachusetts is that after the United States government worked with and helped local populations during the war years, locals came to expect such assistance from the central government after the war. Okay, so it's the performance of the national government, of the United States government, the Continental Congress, and the Continental Army during the war had an effect on Americans. Okay? They saw the services that the national government provided them during the war, and this habituated them or elevated their expectation of what they want this United States government, what role they wanted it to play. And this is why when a new military or diplomatic problem presented itself, like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, or Indian violence on the western frontiers in Ohio or wherever, Kentucky, or Spain hindering American commerce on the Mississippi. Okay, so when these new military and diplomatic difficulties arose, local populations in different parts of America, in different states, and local governments in these states expected a more helpful central government than they had expected back in 1776 or back in 1754, when, if you remember, the Albany Plan was proposed to form some sort of united government over all the colonies, and every colony said, no way, not interested. So the debate between the two camps of historians hinges on when exactly did Americans develop a sense of nationhood, a common identity, a familial bond, and a sense of mutual responsibility to support and come to the aid of fellow Americans. One camp, the first group of historians that I mentioned, sees American identity and American nationhood, American national bonds forming well before the Revolution and producing the Revolution. They see the American Rebellion as a manifestation of this national bond of mutual assistance, this familial bond among Americans. The second camp of historians holds that Americans developed a sense of nationhood only during the war. That Americans' sense of nationhood, again, an American identity and a common bond and a mutual responsibility, that these were products of the harsh experiences of war rather than a cause for the war. Okay? So it's the common suffering and fighting and dying, as well as the common victory, produced a new common identity and bond that had not been there in 1776. But even after the war, many Americans, probably most Americans, were resistant to this new national mentality that's reflected in the federal Constitution. The post-war debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists resuscitated old pre-war fears about centralized and arbitrary power. Usually, such disagreements over policy preferences, should we have this kind of constitution or that kind of constitution? Usually, these kinds of disagreements reflect philosophical or ideological differences. But the ratification debates were odd in that they pitted two sides, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, who did not disagree philosophically. Federalists and Anti-Federalists shared a negative view of human nature. When George Washington, in his 1796 farewell address, when he stepped down from the presidency, When George Washington warned that occupants of public offices love power and are prone to abuse it, he was not suggesting that people who are drawn to government service are bad people, that they're power hungry knaves. Rather, he expressed a widely held Anglo-American understanding that all people, when given political power, gravitate toward abuse of power. Okay. Both Federalists and Anti-Federalists were convinced that governments are necessary to preserve law, order, and justice, but also extremely dangerous, given that the powers of government are wielded by humans. And therefore, government power virtually guarantees abuses of power and arbitrary government and lawlessness and tyranny. The difference, so they agreed on this. They agreed that people with power will abuse it. That was a broad American and English understanding. Where Federalists and Anti-Federalists differed is that Anti-Federalists saw this as a problem that cannot be solved. Okay. And therefore, because corruption and abuse in high places cannot be prevented, the most any society can do is to do away with the high places. Okay. So like the revolutionists of 1776, the Anti-Federalists accepted that governmental abuse was an inescapable fact of life because people with power will abuse it. And therefore, the Anti-Federalists, like the revolutionists of 1776, preferred to endure small local abuses from small local governments than great abuses from a powerful central government. By contrast, Federalists believed that they found a clever solution to the problem of human nature. Madison's formulation of a central government splintered into separate branches and splintered within itself too. Each branch is also splintered internally. And that this government, this splintered government would be restricted, would be limited strictly to a set of enumerated powers. This formulation by Madison was a plan to cheat history. Okay? Federalists believed that the federal government's internal divisions would pit competing interest groups against one another within the structure of the federal government, thus counteracting the gradual and natural concentration of power that had characterized all previous governments in all of human history, both monarchical and republican. Okay, so this separation of powers within the government itself, between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the federal government, and between the two houses of Congress, was to act as an internal structural guardrail against the consolidation of power in the central government. Okay? And this internal fracturing of the government, of the federal government, was then buttressed by an external and theoretical guardrail. And that was the insistence that the central government would be limited, restricted by law, by courts, by local government, and by public opinion to exercise only certain and enumerated powers and no others. Now, the ratification contest revealed that the American people were more skeptical than Madison. Okay, they didn't believe that these clever tricks could counteract the lessons of history, or the pattern of history of concentration of power. And so to draw support away from the the anti-federalist opposition was formidable, very strong. And so to draw support away from the anti-federalists, Federalists agreed to add to the Constitution explicit prohibitions in the form of a Bill of Rights as yet another, a third guardrail. And these 10 amendments to the Constitution overtly barred the federal government from taking certain actions. Okay, so the Bill of Rights, therefore, reflects the fears of 18th century Americans that future federal legislators and executives and judges might not be mindful of Madison's safeguards, and that the separation of powers and the doctrine of enumerated powers were insufficient to interrupt what Jefferson called the natural progress of things, meaning the advance of government at the expense of liberty. Okay. Now, that said, modern observers need to remember that in our minds, the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the federal Constitution was a flip-flop. There was a course reversal. Okay. It's clear to us that a stronger central government, by necessity, weakens local governments within the context of the federal system. Okay, so we understand, because we've been living with the system for 250 years, we understand that there's a trade-off here. But it seems that it's obvious that this trade-off was not as clear to people like Madison and many other Federalists. They sincerely believed that they could have both things at once: create a sovereign and helpful national government without losing the sovereignty of the states. Okay. They believed that with the clever mechanisms that they designed within the federal government, again, separation of powers, 2 separate houses of Congress, checks, balances, the doctrine of enumerated powers, Bill of Rights, that with all these clever fixes, they were able to grant the new federal government necessary governing powers, but without risking the concentration of power that would threaten self-government in the states. This means that many Americans who supported the new federal Constitution did not see it as a rejection of the Republican model of self-government, of self-governing states that the Revolutionists had envisioned when they ratified the Articles of Confederation. When they went to war in 1776 and ratified their first constitution. Federalists and anti-federalists alike believed that they all believed in self-government in the states. They acknowledged the sovereignty of the states, and they feared the concentration of power in a central government. Okay, Federalists and anti-federalists were in the same mind on this. This is why the Federalists didn't have serious reservations about adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, because none of them thought that the federal government should be permitted to do anything that the Bill of Rights prohibits the federal government from doing. Okay, the Federalists didn't think that the federal government should be able to establish a national church or shut down your printing press or take your guns. Okay, so that's why they didn't have a problem putting it on paper in a Bill of Rights. Okay. Federalists differed from anti-federalists and from the revolutionists of 1776 only in believing that their clever mechanisms could prevent the natural progress of things, prevent this fledgling central government from accumulating greater powers, expanding beyond its prescribed jurisdictions, and curtailing self-government in the states. Okay. Now, one last thing. Any discussion of Madison's role in framing the federal constitution and all these solutions requires at least a brief mention of what's called the Madison problem. At the Constitutional Convention, and so during the Philadelphia Convention, and then afterwards during the ratification contest, Madison was a leader and an ally of the most strident Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton. Okay. Now, I should mention, at this point, during the ratification contest, Madison was 36 years old. Okay, so clearly a very young man. And again, he was one of the main leaders of this faction that's usually referred to as the Nationalists. Again, the most ardent Federalists, in wanting to give the new federal government more power and to construct it in a way that would allow it a national scope and represent a national interest rather than being a kind of council of 13 states. So that was during the writing of the drafting of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. But then during Washington's presidency, Madison took a 180-degree turn, becoming the leading figure in the Jeffersonian camp that opposed Hamilton, championed states' rights, railed against the aggrandizement of federal power, and warned against the concentration of power in the central government. So historians have tried to solve this problem ever since. Some point to Madison's personal relationship with Jefferson as explaining this apparent switch. Others point out that as a representative in the House of Representatives, as a congressman for Virginia, Madison came to better understand and appreciate the interests and concerns and fears of his Virginian constituents and of Southern farmers in general with regard to the central government, to the federal government. Okay, so basically that as a representative, he was voicing and came to understand the sensibilities of his constituents. I think a simpler explanation, so the first explanation suggests that he was not sincere, that he was simply doing Jefferson's bidding because Jefferson was the senior statesman of Virginia. The second also suggests that Madison was reflecting in the 1790s, reflecting somebody else's beliefs rather than his own, his constituents' beliefs. I think a simpler and more charitable explanation and more sensible explanation is that when the federal government was only a theoretical construct of Madison's imagination back in 1787 and 88, Madison had faith that his clever safeguards would prevent this government from becoming a source of danger to American citizens. Okay, the federal government would represent citizens' interests rather than threaten them. But after Washington's inauguration, when Hamiltonian office holders started to actually use the machinery of government created by the Constitution, perhaps Madison's eyes were opened to the logic of those anti-federalist skeptics who had insisted on a Bill of Rights and warned that centralization is a slippery slope that gets more slippery and more sloped with time. Okay, so he might have discovered, as young people sometimes do, that their elders might actually know a thing or two.